In the frozen ruins of the Eastern Front, 1942, the German army faced a weapon they did not understand. It wasn't a tank or an artillery piece. It was small, crude, and made of stamped metal. Yet it poured out bullets like a storm. From the trenches near Stalingrad to the forests of Karelia, German troops began reporting the same thing. The Russians have a new submachine gun. It never stops firing. At first, the German High Command dismissed the reports. They believed the Soviet Union, struggling under invasion, could not produce advanced weapons. But then, as the battles intensified, the truth became impossible to ignore. German infantry units captured dozens of the Soviet PPSh-41, the PPSh, as the Red Army called it. It was ugly, it was cheap, it was made of stamped steel and wood, held together with simplicity rather than precision. And yet it worked, in mud, in snow, in blood. One German officer wrote, "We used to laugh at Russian engineering. We are not laughing now." In 1942, the first captured PPSh-41s were sent back to the Wehrmacht's weapons testing centers in Kummersdorf and Erfurt. German engineers, men who prided themselves on craftsmanship, on the perfection of their Luger pistols and MP-40 submachine guns, were stunned by what they found. The PPSh was like nothing they had ever designed. It wasn't built for elegance, it was built for war. The engineers stripped it down piece by piece. There were no fine screws, no delicate machining, no unnecessary ornamentation, just pressed steel, a simple blowback system, and a massive drum magazine that could hold 71 rounds. To the Germans accustomed to the precision of the MP-40's milled parts, this was barbaric, but brilliant. In their reports, they wrote that the PPSh-41 could be produced in a fraction of the time it took to make an MP-40, at a fraction of the cost. Soviet factories could churn them out by the thousands, even under bombardment. Entire divisions of Red Army troops could be armed faster than the Germans could replace their losses. What shocked them most was its performance. The PPSh fired at nearly 900 rounds per minute, almost twice the rate of the MP-40. It spat fire, a roar of bullets that overwhelmed German lines at close range. It wasn't accurate beyond 100 meters, but it didn't have to be. In the close combat of ruined cities and forests, volume mattered more than precision. One German soldier who had survived Stalingrad wrote afterward, "When you heard the chatter of the PPSh, you hit the ground. You didn't have time to think." When German engineers finished their testing, they reached an astonishing conclusion. This crude Soviet weapon was not inferior. It was superior in its purpose. It was a gun made for soldiers, not for engineers. Easy to use, easy to clean, and almost impossible to break. The reports went up the chain of command to the Oberkommando des Heer, the German Army High Command, and for the first time, they began to consider something unthinkable. The Germans, masters of military precision, might have to copy the weapon of the very enemy they had mocked. It was not a matter of pride anymore. It was a matter of survival. By early 1943, the engineers at Kummersdorf had completed their detailed study of the Soviet PPSh-41. Their reports were precise, methodical, and reluctantly admiring. They described the weapon as a model of efficiency under conditions of scarcity. In other words, it was the perfect gun for total war. What struck the Germans most was how the Soviets had designed it for mass production. The PPSh required no specialized machinery, no expert gunsmiths. Its components were stamped, welded, or riveted together by unskilled laborers, even women and teenagers. Where a single MP-40 might take hours to assemble, the PPSh could be made in less than half that time. German officers studying Soviet supply chains realized that this was not just a weapon, it was an industrial strategy. The Soviet Union had turned simplicity into an advantage. Factories relocated deep in the Urals churned out thousands of PPShs each month, while Germany, obsessed with precision, was drowning in production delays. The engineers compared the two weapons directly. The German MP-40, though elegant and well-balanced, had its flaws. A slow rate of fire, limited range, and a tendency to jam in mud or snow. The PPSh, by contrast, could be dropped, frozen, or clogged with dirt. and it would still fire. One Kummersdorf engineer wrote in his notebook, "This gun is a soldier's dream. It is crude, yes, but indestructible. You could bury it in snow for a week, dig it up, and it would still shoot." Soon, word of the weapon's performance spread beyond the testing centers. On the front lines, German troops began capturing PPShs in large numbers and using them themselves. It became common to see Wehrmacht soldiers in the ruins of Stalingrad or the forests of Smolensk carrying the enemy's gun. At first, officers were hesitant. German doctrine discouraged the use of foreign weapons, but practicality overruled pride. Ammunition for the PPSh was plentiful, taken from captured Soviet stockpiles. Soldiers began to prefer it to their own MP-40s, calling it the Russian hose for its relentless stream of bullets. One German sergeant reportedly said, "When you pick it up, you don't feel like a marksman. You feel like a survivor." This forced the German high command to make a decision. They could no longer ignore what was happening in the field. The PPSh-41 had proven itself in the harshest conditions imaginable, and now it was arming both sides of the front. In early 1943, the Wehrmacht's weapons office issued an order. Captured Soviet PPSh-41s would be officially modified for German use. The gun would be rechambered to fire 9 by 19mm parabellum rounds, the same ammunition as the MP-40. It would receive a new barrel and a few internal changes, and then be reissued to German troops under a new designation, the MP-41R. The irony was profound. The German war machine, built on precision and superiority, had adopted the enemy's weapon because it worked better. And as engineers continued to test it, they came to an uncomfortable realization. In the brutal simplicity of Soviet design, there was genius. By the spring of 1943, captured PPSh-41s were appearing across the Eastern Front. Not in Soviet hands, but in those of German soldiers. The transformation was startling. Elite units of the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, men once fiercely loyal to their own weapons, now carried a gun forged by the very enemy they despised. The Germans called it the MP-41R. Maschinenpistole 41 Russisch. On the battlefield, it was instantly recognizable. The round drum magazine, the wooden stock, and the sharp mechanical chatter that set it apart from the MP-40's slower rhythm. Soldiers prized it for its reliability and rate of fire, nearly 900 rounds per minute. In the chaos of close combat, in ruined cities, frozen trenches, and forests thick with smoke, it was a weapon made for survival. One veteran from the 6th Army recalled years later, "You could feel it breathing when you fired." It wasn't a weapon, it was a heartbeat. The conversion process itself was a testament to German efficiency. In workshops across occupied Europe, engineers modified thousands of captured PPShs. They replaced the 7.62mm barrels with 9mm ones, machined to fit the German standard. The Soviet drum magazines were often swapped for the more reliable 35-round box magazines. The process was quick, cheap, and effective. For every German-made submachine gun that took days to assemble, several captured PPShs could be adapted in hours. It was a rare moment of pragmatism in a war often defined by ideology. At Kummersdorf, engineers continued to test both the original and converted versions. What fascinated them most was the gun's tolerance. It could handle dust, frost, and even warped ammunition, conditions that would cripple most Western firearms. One test report noted dryly, "We attempted to induce failure through neglect. The weapon refused." This simple sentence captured the heart of the matter. The PPSh was not perfect, but it was unstoppable. Even the propaganda ministries took notice. German films, once mocking the crude Russian weapons, quietly stopped making such claims. Soldiers joked that the PPSh was as ugly as war and just as relentless. Behind the lines, engineers studied the weapon's stamped steel body with increasing admiration. The PPSh was proof that function could outweigh form, that brute practicality could win where precision failed. As German production began to falter under Allied bombing, this lesson became painfully clear. The Luftwaffe's factories struggled to stay operational. Steel and fuel were scarce. But the Soviets kept producing their weapons in factories buried in the Urals or disguised as tractor plants. To the men at Kummersdorf, it was both humbling and terrifying. They realized that the PPSh-41 represented more than a gun. It represented a philosophy of war. The Germans had built weapons for victory. The Soviets had built theirs for survival. And by 1943, it was survival, not victory, that was winning. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the PPSh-41 was no longer just a Soviet weapon. It had become a fixture on both sides of the Eastern Front. The German engineers studying it at Kummersdorf began to see it as more than a battlefield curiosity. It was a symbol of something they had underestimated: Soviet adaptability. Reports from the front told the same story again and again. German units, especially those fighting in Stalingrad, Kursk, and the vast forests of Belarus, had scavenged the PPSh wherever they could. When the bitter cold froze the bolts of the MP-40, the Soviet gun kept firing. When mud clogged their weapons, the PPSh spat lead as though it were born of the earth itself. One field officer wrote in frustration, "The Russian weapon is crude, but it does not care. It works when ours will not." At the Rechlin and Kummersdorf proving grounds, German engineers dismantled the PPSh for the 100th time, looking for its secret. They found none. Its simplicity was the secret. Its design ignored convention. No polish, no perfection. It was stamped from sheet metal, riveted, and assembled with parts that could be replaced by unskilled workers. The weapon embodied the Soviet system: mass production, endurance, and the power of simplicity. One engineer reportedly said, "It is the weapon of a nation that has no time to waste and no men to spare." By now, tens of thousands of captured PPSh-41s had been rechambered for 9mm ammunition. German armorers had perfected the process, turning Soviet stockpiles into their own supply chain. But what they couldn't replicate was the scale. The Soviets could produce 100,000 PPShs in the time it took Germany to produce 10,000 MP-40s. Their factories in Izhevsk and Tula ran day and night, producing weapons faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. To the German command, this was a revelation chivalrous and a warning. Even the Luftwaffe's weapons officers began requesting PPShs for airfield defense. The irony was inescapable. The world's most advanced military machine now relied on its enemy's weapon to hold the line. In the barracks, soldiers traded MP-40s for PPShs whenever they could. The captured guns became prized possessions, not trophies but lifelines. The men gave them nicknames: Bolshevitzenschleuder, Bolshevik Slinger. They cursed its weight but trusted its reliability. For the engineers, though, admiration came with unease. They began to realize that their philosophy of design, precision over quantity, elegance over utility, had failed them. They had built masterpieces that couldn't endure the brutality of total war. The Soviets had done the opposite. They built a gun that anyone could use, anyone could fix, and anyone could replace. By the summer of 1944, as the Red Army pushed westward, the German engineers knew what that meant. The same factories that produced the PPSh were now producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition, all in terrifying quantities. And with each advance, more German soldiers fell into Soviet hands, leaving behind more weapons for the Red Army to recycle. The PPSh had started as a Soviet triumph. Now it had become a mirror, reflecting the failure of Germany's industrial arrogance. One engineer wrote in his final report from Kummersdorf, "The Russian gun is not superior because it is better. It is superior because it endures. We have built machines for victory. They have built them for survival. And that is why they are winning." By early 1944, the Wehrmacht's relationship with the PPSh-41 had gone from curiosity to dependence. In the field, the gun was everywhere, sometimes more common than German weapons themselves. From the snowy outskirts of Leningrad to the shattered streets of Warsaw, the sound of its rapid 900 rounds per minute fire echoed from both sides of the front. At testing centers deep inside Germany, engineers continued their analysis. They had measured every part, charted every curve, and compared it line by line with their own MP-40. But the conclusion was always the same. The PPSh-41 was crude, but perfect for its purpose. Its stamped receiver could be made by factories that once built pots and pans. Its drum magazine carried 71 rounds, heavy but devastating in close quarters. Its wooden stock was thick, unrefined, yet unbreakable. The Germans could no longer laugh at it. One engineer remarked, "It is not a gun, it is a tool, and it is built to survive its user." The difference between the two nations' weapons revealed a deeper truth about their war industries. German weapons were built like luxury cars, fine-tuned, precise, and temperamental. Soviet weapons were built like tractors, rough, simple, and unstoppable. When the German High Command issued the order to rechamber the PPSh for 9mm, the engineers at Irma Verica began production of what they called the MP-41R. The R for Russisch, meaning Russian tens of thousands of captured PPShs, were modified this way, fitted with new barrels and simpler magazines. But no matter how many they converted, they could never keep up with Soviet output. For every German-modified gun, the Red Army produced 10 new ones. In Wrestling, engineers began stress tests to understand how long a PPSh could operate without cleaning or maintenance. They fired it until the barrel glowed red, until the receiver was caked with carbon and dirt. Still, it worked. They submerged it in mud, sand, snow. It jammed but cleared with a single kick or shake. It was an engineer's nightmare and a soldier's dream. A Luftwaffe technician who observed the tests wrote later, "We have created machines that need engineers. They have created one that needs only courage." The weapon's origin also fascinated the Germans. Designed by Georgy Shpagin, a man with no formal engineering degree, the PPSh was a product of ingenuity born from necessity. It used as few parts as possible, and every component could be built by unskilled labor. To the Germans, this was unthinkable. A mass-produced weapon made by people who had never before built guns, yet one that rivaled the best of their arsenal. By mid-1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing. German forces were retreating across hundreds of kilometers, and the PPSh was everywhere, in Soviet hands, in German hands, in partisan hands. It had become the universal weapon of the Eastern War. Its distinctive drum rattle could be heard in forests, trenches, and cities alike. The rhythm of industrial warfare itself. At Kummersdorf, engineers were ordered to draft a final report for the German High Command. It would summarize everything they had learned from testing the PPSh. The report concluded, "It is the simplest automatic weapon in the world. It is cheap, reliable, and effective. Its production requires neither skill nor precision. Its endurance in battle is unmatched. This weapon represents not technological superiority, but industrial inevitability." The irony was not lost on them. The same engineers who once mocked Soviet design now recognized that their enemy's strength lay not in perfection, but in endurance, a quality Germany had begun to lose. And as the eastern skies filled once again with the thunder of advancing Soviet forces, the lesson of the PPSh-41 became unmistakable. It was not just a weapon, it was a philosophy, one that the Germans could understand, but no longer replicate. By late 1944, the German engineers who had studied the PPSh-41 were no longer testing it out of curiosity, they were testing it out of desperation. The tide of war had turned. The Wehrmacht was in retreat on all fronts, and production lines in Germany were collapsing under relentless Allied bombing. In the chaos, a new question emerged. Could Germany adopt the Soviet method of simplicity before it was too late? At Erfurt and Suhl, engineers began experimenting with stripped-down weapon designs inspired by what they had learned from the PPSh. Some of these early prototypes would eventually lead to the Volkssturmgewehr, the People's Assault Rifle. But while the Germans tried to simplify their weapons, the truth became painfully clear. It was not only about design, it was about mindset. The Soviet Union had embraced the philosophy of practicality from the start. Their weapons were made to be built quickly, repaired easily, and used brutally. The PPSh was the embodiment of that approach, an instrument of mass production made for total war. One German weapons officer wrote bitterly, "We tried to outthink our enemy. They simply outbuilt us inside one of the testing hangars at Rechlin. A group of engineers continued their evaluations. They recorded the results of every endurance test, every malfunction, every modification. The PPSh kept defying expectations. Even with its barrel worn smooth, even after thousands of rounds, it still fired. To the Germans, the weapon seemed indestructible, almost alive. It didn't demand care or precision. It just worked. Out on the front, soldiers echoed the same sentiment. A captured report from a German infantry division near the Vistula River read, "When possible, troops replace MP-44s with Russian submachine guns. Greater rate of fire, more durable in mud and snow." That simple statement said more than any test report ever could. The frontline soldiers, the men who lived and died in trenches, had chosen function over pride. In Berlin, the engineers tried to present their findings to the high command. But by then, Germany's industrial system was breaking down. Factories lacked materials. Skilled workers had been drafted into the army. Allied bombers darkened the skies daily. The time for innovation had passed. Still, in their final reports, the engineers wrote of what they had learned. They praised the PPSh's simplicity and criticized their own system's obsession with perfection. They admitted for the first time that Germany had built itself into a corner. Too advanced to adapt, too proud to simplify. As one engineer later recalled after the war, "We had the minds of craftsmen, not of industrialists. They built weapons for a nation at war. We built weapons for a nation that thought war was an art." It was a brutal truth, but an honest one. The PPSh-41 had done more than arm the Red Army. It had revealed the philosophical divide between the two sides. The Germans sought mastery through precision. The Soviets found strength through efficiency. By the time the engineers concluded their research, the war was entering its final act. The Red Army was advancing toward the Oder River. Soviet soldiers carried the same weapon that had once been dismissed as primitive. In factories across the East, new PPShs were rolling off the assembly lines by the thousands each week. In the ruins of Germany, the engineers understood the irony. They had admired, analyzed, and even copied the weapon that was now destroying them. The PPSh-41 had become more than a gun. It was the embodiment of total war, the product of a nation willing to trade elegance for endurance. And for the German engineers who had once laughed at it, the lesson was as humbling as it was final. As one of them later said during Allied interrogation in 1945, "We learned too late that in war, the simplest weapon is often the strongest." By early 1945, the sound of the PPSh-41 had become one of the most recognizable and most feared on the Eastern Front. Its rapid, rattling burst echoed through every ruined city, from Warsaw to Königsberg. For the German soldiers fighting there, that sound meant the Red Army was close, and that retreat was inevitable. The weapon that German engineers had once studied out of curiosity now haunted their every step. It was simple, brutal, and omnipresent. Soviet factories working day and night had produced more than 6 million PPSh-41s by the end of the war. There were enough for every infantry squad, tank crew, and partisan fighter. The PPSh wasn't just a gun anymore. It was a flood of steel and gunpowder that no army could contain. In contrast, the Germans were running out of everything: fuel, steel, ammunition, and time. Even their vaunted MP-40 submachine gun, the pride of the Wehrmacht, could not keep pace. It was too slow to produce, too fragile in the cold, too expensive to replace. As one German officer wrote in his final field report, "We have created a weapon for soldiers. They have created a weapon for war." Inside the last functioning engineering offices in Germany, the men who had once tested the PPSh worked under candlelight. They knew the war was over, but their minds were restless. They couldn't forget what they had seen: a weapon so simple that it could be built in half the time and work twice as long. Some engineers began sketching their own designs inspired by it: rough stamped metal frames, open bolt systems, curved magazines. These blueprints would never reach the battlefield, but they showed something profound. The Germans had learned. One of the last reports from the Rechlin Test Center read, "The Soviet submachine gun represents a new form of warfare, one defined by mass, speed, and function. It is not the individual soldier that wins the war, but the system that supplies him. The Luftwaffe had been grounded, the panzer divisions were shattered, and in Berlin officials clung to propaganda about miracle weapons, jet fighters, rockets, and new rifles that would never come in time. But on the front lines, the truth was already clear. The PPSh-41 had outlasted them, not because it was perfect, but because it was enough. It could be dropped in mud, frozen in snow, and still fire. It could be made by the millions in factories far from the front. The German engineers, obsessed with precision, had underestimated the power of good enough. Captured German officers began confessing the same realization. During interrogations, one recalled seeing Soviet soldiers charging through smoke, with PPShs blazing. He said, "They fought like machines, never stopping to reload. It wasn't just courage. It was that weapon. It never failed them." In the ruins of Warsaw, another prisoner reportedly told his interrogator, "If we had built guns like theirs, maybe we'd still have an army." The irony was complete. The Germans had entered the war with a belief in superiority, that their engineering, discipline, and order made them unbeatable. But the PPSh-41 had shown them a different truth. War was not a contest of refinement, it was a contest of endurance. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into Germany, thousands of captured German soldiers were now armed with PPSh themselves, their own weapons discarded in favor of the enemy's. Photographs from 1945 show German troops marching under Soviet guard, carrying the same guns they had once ridiculed. By the time the Red Army reached the Oder, there was no laughter left. The weapon the Germans had mocked as crude had become the instrument of their defeat. In his last wartime journal entry, a captured German engineer wrote, "We studied it to understand how it worked. Now it is teaching us why we lost." The PPSh-41 was no longer just a weapon. It had become a symbol of resilience, of adaptability, and of a nation that had turned its simplicity into an unstoppable force. As the Red Army swept westward in 1945, the PPSh-41 became the sound of Soviet victory. Its rapid, relentless chatter echoed through the ruined cities of Eastern Europe, Stettin, Breslau, and Berlin. To the Germans, that sound was no longer strange. It was the rhythm of defeat. In the final months of the war, captured German engineers watched the front collapse and saw their own weapons fail under conditions their enemy's guns seemed to thrive in. The PPSh had survived everything: snow, sand, blood, and years of brutal fighting. Its creators had built it to serve a peasant army, and that design philosophy had triumphed. One German technician, working at a captured Soviet factory in Poland, reportedly remarked, "They build them by the thousands, and each one works." That is their genius, not perfection, but endless supply. The engineers compared that to their own situation: a shrinking industrial base, bombed railways, and over-engineered weapons that needed skilled hands and scarce materials. In that comparison, they saw not just military failure, but philosophical defeat. The more they studied the PPSh, the clearer its brilliance became. The gun's design, a simple blowback system firing from an open bolt, could be manufactured in any metal workshop. The barrel shroud, the drum magazine, even the wooden stock could be made by unskilled laborers. It was a weapon designed for chaos, for a war that consumed everything. German submachine guns like the MP-40 required precision tooling and careful fitting. The PPSh didn't. It was made to be stamped, welded, and handed to a soldier within hours. In a war of attrition, that difference was everything. One engineer wrote in his notes, "We tried to outsmart them. They simply outbuilt us." In April 1945, as Soviet troops surrounded Berlin, reports showed that 1 in 3 Red Army soldiers carried a PPSh-41. Even tank crews and artillerymen slung them over their shoulders. The Germans couldn't ignore the symbolism: an army armed not with fragile precision, but with rugged simplicity, overwhelming in number and determination. Inside the Reich's last research facilities, engineers were still tinkering with experimental weapons. The St. G-44, the Volkssturmgewehr, and a dozen desperate prototypes. But all of them shared a problem: they came too late. The PPSh had already proven that the war belonged not to the few, but to the many. When captured engineers were interrogated after the war, Allied officers often asked which enemy weapon had impressed them most. Some mentioned the T-34 tank, others the Katyusha rocket launcher, but many named the PPSh-41. One German weapons designer told his captors, "It is not beautiful, but it never quits. It is the gun of an army that will not stop." That sentiment was echoed across reports from the field. German officers admitted that the PPSh had changed infantry combat, making Soviet soldiers more dangerous in close quarters and more confident under fire. The weapon's sheer rate of fire, over 900 rounds per minute, turned every skirmish into a storm of lead. The irony was bitter. The same engineers who had laughed at the crude Soviet gun now realized that its simplicity was its perfection. It did not need elegance, it needed endurance. It was a machine made for men who expected no mercy from war. In the ashes of the Eastern Front, the lesson was clear. Germany had built for precision. The Soviets had built for survival, and survival had won. Even after the fighting stopped, the PPSh lived on. The Germans had tested it, copied it, and now, in defeat, they carried it. Many German prisoners of war marched eastward with PPSh-41s in their hands, not as soldiers, but as captives. The weapon that had defeated them now guarded them. In post-war Europe, Soviet soldiers proudly called it "Papasha," Daddy. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the resilience and determination that had crushed the Reich. The German engineers had once thought they understood war, that technology and discipline would always prevail. But in the burned-out cities and frozen forests, they had learned a different truth. Sometimes the simplest tool, made for the harshest hands, becomes the most powerful weapon of all. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Red Army's victory parades rolled through the ruins of Europe. Among the banners and flags, one sound echoed louder than the drums: the clatter of the PPSh-41. It was more than a weapon. It was the heartbeat of the Soviet triumph. German officers, now prisoners, watched in silence as the same weapon they had once dismissed passed before them in the hands of men who had marched from Stalingrad to Berlin. It was a bitter sight. For years they had mocked Soviet design, calling it crude, unrefined, unworthy of a modern army. Now the lesson stood before them, undeniable. The PPSh-41 had been produced in millions, over 6 million units by the end of the war. It armed not only frontline infantry, but tank crews, partisans, and even militia fighters. The sheer scale of its presence across the battlefield had overwhelmed the German front lines in a way no strategic genius could have countered. One captured German engineer later said, "We had better weapons, but they had more, and theirs always worked." In the Soviet factories, production never stopped. Even when cities burned and rail lines were cut, makeshift workshops in the Urals and Siberia kept turning out parts for the PPSh. Its design made it unstoppable. No need for expensive materials, no fragile tolerances. It could be built in the dark, under bombing raids by workers with little training. To German engineers, this was a revelation. Their factories had relied on precision machines, highly skilled labor, and vast logistics chains. When those collapsed under Allied bombing, production halted. But the Soviets, with their crude yet brilliant designs, could keep building. The PPSh was proof that simplicity could outlast sophistication. One engineer summed it up bluntly: "Our weapons demanded perfection. Theirs demanded only steel." The Germans had tested the PPSh extensively, even before the war's end. They had adopted a version of it themselves, the MP-41R, captured in huge quantities on the Eastern Front. Many Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units used them gladly, praising their reliability and devastating firepower. It was a strange twist of fate. The army that had laughed at the Soviet weapon now carried it proudly into battle. Soldiers scrounged for 7.62 by 25mm ammunition, stripped fallen Soviet soldiers of drums and magazines, and even requested the weapon officially through their quartermasters. One SS officer, in a report from 1944, wrote, "Our men prefer the Russian submachine gun. It never jams, it never quits." To the engineers who had once believed in German superiority, this was humbling. The PPSh-41 was not just a success of engineering, it was a triumph of ideology. It reflected the Soviet way of war, collective, relentless, and adaptive. It was not a weapon for heroes or aces, it was a weapon for millions, and that was its true genius. As one German prisoner later remarked during an interrogation, the PPSh was the Red Army itself, rough, loud, and unstoppable. After the war, the PPSh's influence spread far beyond Europe. The Chinese copied it as the Type 50. The Koreans carried it through the hills of the Korean peninsula. The Vietnamese used it in the jungles of Indochina. It became a global symbol of resistance and revolution. But to the Germans who had tested it first, it remained something else. A reminder of what they had failed to understand. They had believed victory would come through precision and perfection. But the PPSh had shown them a harder truth, that in the chaos of modern war, the simplest design wins. By the time Germany rebuilt its army after the war, the engineers who had examined the PPSh carried that lesson with them. They began to value standardization, simplicity, and reliability, principles that would shape post-war European design for decades. One former Luftwaffe technician, interviewed in the 1950s, said, "The PPSh taught us humility. It taught us that war is not about brilliance, it is about endurance." And so, the weapon that had once been mocked by German experts became the one they admired most. It had no polish, no luxury, and no vanity, but it had something far greater. A design born from necessity and perfected by struggle. The Germans had tested it, studied it, and finally respected it. They had seen its power firsthand, and they would never laugh at it again. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was a graveyard of machines. Tanks lay rusting in the mud, aircraft wrecks dotted the fields, and rifles littered the ground like fallen leaves. But among them, one weapon stood out, not for its beauty, but for its endurance. The PPSh-41, the Papasha, had survived everything. In the aftermath of the war, Allied intelligence units scoured captured German archives. Among blueprints, field reports, and test logs, they found something surprising. Detailed evaluations of the PPSh-41, written by German engineers and weapons officers. These documents revealed how deeply the Wehrmacht had come to respect the Soviet submachine gun they once scorned. One report described it simply, an ugly masterpiece, designed by war for war. The Germans had dissected its construction, tested its endurance, and even incorporated elements of its design into their own late-war weapons, most notably the MP-44 Sturmgewehr, the world's first true assault rifle. The idea of combining simplicity, mass production, and automatic fire was no longer dismissed. It was embraced. The PPSh had changed the way even its enemies thought about weapons. To understand the shock it caused, one must remember the mindset of German industry before the war. The Reich believed in precision above all, tight tolerances, expert craftsmanship, perfection in every detail. But the war exposed the flaw in that philosophy. Perfection is slow, expensive, and fragile. The Soviets had taken the opposite path. The PPSh was rough, cheap, and fast to make. Yet it worked in mud, ice, and blood. It could be repaired with a hammer. It could be built in a factory, a warehouse, or even a basement. One German engineer later wrote in his memoirs, "We were craftsmen. They were builders. And in total war, builders win." When German prisoners were later interrogated by the Allies, many admitted they had used the PPSh in combat. Some said they preferred it even to their own MP-40. Its drum magazine gave it a terrifying rate of fire, and its simplicity meant it almost never jammed, even when packed with snow or dirt. Captured photos show Wehrmacht soldiers smiling, PPShs in hand, their original weapons abandoned. The irony was impossible to ignore. The mighty German army, armed with the best technology of its age, had chosen a Soviet weapon to stay alive. By 1945, the PPSh-41 had become more than a submachine gun. It was a symbol of the Red Army's philosophy. that victory belonged to the relentless, not the refined. It proved that the simplest designs, when multiplied by millions, could shape the outcome of a world war. Even as German engineers returned home after the collapse, they carried that lesson with them. When post-war Europe began rebuilding, the new wave of firearms, from the AK-47 to the CETME and G3, bore the fingerprints of that realization. Simplicity, reliability, and mass production would rule the future. In the years that followed, the PPSh appeared on every battlefield of the Cold War. From the frozen hills of Korea to the jungles of Vietnam, its sound became the voice of revolution, the echo of a weapon that had once humbled the most advanced army in the world. It never needed to evolve much. It didn't have to. Its original design, forged in desperation, remained effective long after more modern weapons had come and gone. As one historian later wrote, the PPSh was not just a gun. It was proof that simplicity wins wars. The German engineers who tested the PPSh in Rechlin had once laughed at it. A crude weapon from a backward nation, they thought. But as they watched their own factories crumble and their weapons fail in the mud, the truth became undeniable. The PPSh-41 was everything their designs were not: simple, reliable, and built for the harsh reality of war. It didn't need perfection, it only needed to work. And in the end, that was what made it unstoppable. The Germans had mocked it. Then they tested it. Then they copied it. The PPSh-41 had done more than fire bullets. It had fired a lesson into history itself. The laughter was gone. Only respect remained. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.